While many folks are still arguing about whether the virus came from a lab in China or not, they're missing a much more important question. What if the entire global response to the virus, we're talking economy crushing lockdowns, social distancing, invasive surveillance, even the use of mechanical ventilators, came straight from the top levels of the CCP? According to my guest today, that's exactly what happened. Michael Senger is an attorney and author of the newly published book, Snake Oil: How Xi Jinping Shut Down the World. Michael, thank you so much for joining me today, and thank you for all the work that you're doing.
Thank you, Seth. Very glad to be here.
So, you are an attorney, and you just stumbled across some anomalies in seeing how the world was handling the COVID reaction, whether it was the lockdowns or the policies, and you started digging and researching. And that led to what became your recently published book, which is actually right here for those of you that are, I'll be talking about it a lot today with Michael. So I highly recommend you get it. But you basically pieced together a picture that all these policies, which we hadn't seen before, they've never used lockdowns or social distancing to handle a virus. And through your research, a lot of it pointed straight back to the CCP. So why don't you walk us through that process?
That's exactly right. Really, I think as everyone recalls, it goes all the way back to March 2020, and um, suddenly the world was just overcome with this terror of this virus. Going back to the beginning of 2020, there was these, videos coming out of China, of people, falling dead and just collapsing suddenly in the streets, having these, seizures, and just all these horrifying videos, all of which were subsequently proven to be fake. But that was really the world's first impression of this virus. That you just had this entire terror campaign, and one thing led to another. Then you had stories of these fake whistleblowers, blowing the whistle, Liu and Lang, um, about this super virus that was coming out of China, and that's really all anybody knew about it at that time. One thing led to another, and suddenly, you have the entire world shutting down, and there was this consensus, uh, that just this kind of snap consensus that every country should do that, and like dominoes, following Italy, then throughout Europe, then one country after another just takes this policy of lockdown, and with very little debate, just shuts down, their entire society, their entire economy. Um, and first, I think like everybody else, when I first saw Italy do this, I'm like, huh, that's strange. I didn't think that's something Italy could do. I thought they were more, democratic country, more like us. I thought something was a little odd about that. And as one more country after another implements this policy, and then it comes here to United States, and California is the first state that goes into lockdown, and I'm just like, wait a minute, that doesn't, that's just completely antithetical to our values.
And you're in California, is that correct?
Correct, I am now. Yeah,
So you're on the front lines of of this. You're California or New York City, right?
Yeah, exactly. It is the front lines in a lot of ways. San Francisco was the first city within the United States that adopted this policy. Um, so I see California and some other states going into lockdown. I think that's the moment I feel like there's something seriously off about this. This is very strange. Not only were they adopting this policy, this very unprecedented policy, but they're doing it with absolutely no debate. Um, I'm just at that point, I'm just your typical New York Times, Economist, Wall Street Journal reader, um, and they're implementing this just dramatic, unprecedented policy that's going to affect millions of lives and shutting down virtually any debate about the topic. You're just not even allowed to ask questions about this, and all these commentators just, oh, this is totally normal. It's going to shut down the entire economy and toss millions of people out of work. There's absolutely nothing normal about it. And so I immediately realized that, there's something very off about adopting a policy from China with absolutely no debate about it, giving everything that's going on in China, just, the backslide into totalitarianism under Xi Jinping. Um, and then I think even more so, as I saw developing countries adopt this policy, you had India and then countries in Africa suddenly shutting down. And, essentially, a shutdown in a country like that means condemning millions of people to starvation. I mean, that is just, you know, absolutely abhorrent, and in that context, murderous.
Especially
And
because
that's when I realized,
a lot of those countries, they're not, say, having a job where they work for nationwide insurance and they move to remote working. They're working in
right,
factories.
yeah,
So a shutdown for them, like, there's no Zoom call-in way to still go to work. So for them, it means their entire livelihood. And, say, India, for instance, one person working might be supporting a large family.
that's exactly right. They're working in factories far from home, sending money home. Not only is there no remote work, there's no safety net either. There's no, you don't get unemployment and stimulus checks when you work in a country like that. So not only were lockdowns in the developed world affecting the economies in those countries, but then they were implementing lockdowns themselves. And that's when it hit me that, okay, there's something seriously off about this. There's something, this is just ungodly that they're doing this. And it struck me as just horrendously evil that they could be doing this. Even if theoretically they were maybe saving some lives. I think in hindsight they didn't really save any lives by doing this. But even if they were preventing some spread of this virus, to condemn millions of people to starvation like that is just horrendously unethical.
Is there
So
any historical precedent? Have we ever used lockdowns to combat viruses or anything like that?
there is not, and I didn't have much background in epidemiology before COVID, I think like most people. And that really was kind of the forensic research that I embarked on after realizing early on that, this policy was very off and could have been promulgated through fraudulent pretenses, through corruption and the World Health Organization and other international organizations. But really, the research project that kind of embarked on, uh, me and some others realized very quickly that these policies are not precedented. Not only are they completely unprecedented within the Western world, but they are not part of any pandemic plan in the Western world. Developed countries, the ones you would suspect, the most advanced countries, the United States, European countries, Australia, they all have their own pandemic plans. And lockdowns are not only not part of those pandemic plans, but if you go back and read the literature leading to them, they're systematically ruled out as just this horrible apocalyptic idea that this should never be done. Like, absolutely, under no circumstances, do not do this. So they have been thought through and deemed by the most prominent experts in the field to be complete nonsense, a complete non-starter. And here, all of a sudden, just within a matter of weeks, really based on absolutely nothing except the World Health Organization saying, this policy worked in China, that by Xi Jinping shutting down Wuhan, China for 2 months, apparently that eliminated the virus from all of China. I mean, unbelievably stupid when you actually stop and think about that for a few seconds. But that is the story by which the entire world shut down. Just destroyed millions of lives and people's livelihoods. Condemned millions and millions of people to unemployment and even starvation in many cases. All based on that idea that by shutting down Wuhan for 2 months, the dictator of China had eliminated the virus from all of China. That just complete absurdity, and it's absolutely horrifying and absolutely sad to realize that that's what happened. But that was laundered into policy purely on that basis.
So you mentioned that, yeah, I remember, in your book, you talk about New Zealand, for instance, how they have an entire protocol for how to handle pandemics, as most countries do. And so at the beginning of this, the pandemic, that you saw a switch, right? So something happened where all of a sudden all these countries, and I think even states here in America, Italy, European countries, they throw out very quickly, they throw out their existing, uh, I guess, action plans on how to handle this, and it gets replaced by what China's doing. And I think it was New Zealand specifically where you went into detail and showed that it was almost verbatim, that they just took exactly what China was doing, which is kind of odd because, say, a few years back, you would never look to China as being the model idea for hardly anything, right? They've got, mass starvation, mass poverty. They're slaughtering their people. You wouldn't really look to them as, it would make more sense if we look to, say, Switzerland. It's like, okay, yeah, they've really mastered how to handle this. But everyone looking to China, that's really, really suspicious.
Yeah, you know, that's exactly right. China is, a backward country in many ways. It's still also a developing country. It really just doesn't have as advanced of scientific institutions, as advanced of an economy. That's aside from the fact that it's, completely slid into totalitarianism, has an absolute ruler now under Xi Jinping, and a regime that has always been extraordinarily brutal, has never be- has never really reformed. Not only that, but is very well known to virtually everyone within foreign policy that they regularly bribe and blackmail and corrupt officials and institutions around the world. You put all that together, and it does not paint a rosy picture of why the entire world suddenly chose to throw out their pandemic plans, which, as you said, were very sophisticated, very advanced, very well thought out in place, and those were all to kind of suddenly tossed into the garbage heap. And like you said, with New Zealand suddenly adopted this policy of zero COVID, and you look at this zero COVID plan, which they adopted in April of 2020, and every single one of these policies, and they admit as much within the plan, is just cut and pasted exactly from what the CCP claims that they did in Wuhan to, supposedly eliminate a virus from all of China by, shutting down Wuhan. And oh, here's what we did. You have to, have mass testing, and you have to, have, contact tracing, and quarantine centers, and all this crazy dystopian stuff that the world has been doing for the last 2 years. All the elements of a permanent pandemic essentially are what is in this plan that is supposedly taken from the Chinese response in Wuhan to achieve zero COVID.
And something that really struck me with your research was that, because I remember early on watching this, I remember watching the videos of Wuhan with people falling in the street, and I mean, it looked like something from a sci-fi movie. Like it looked like
Right.
The Stand, like a Stephen King novel is what you saw playing out. But then you never saw that carry into the rest of the world. And there's different ideas about that. But then what you really helped put together through your research was that it's the term psyop, right, or psychological operation, which is something our CIA has been doing. A lot of governments do this. They whether it's a false flag event or something, that they create an event or something that then shifts the public perception of something, right? So what kind of came to me through reading what you've done is that Wuhan was a psyop, that Wuhan was very intentionally crafted in a way to make the world very fearful of COVID, because then it became the pretense of like, look how bad Wuhan was. People are falling over, dying in the street. Yet all of a sudden we've now fixed Wuhan. So can you go into a little bit of that, just the psyop of Wuhan?
Yeah, yeah. I think that's an outstanding question. Um, that we may never even know the answer to, is to what extent Wuhan was a pre-planned psyop, how long they have been planning it for, how well in advance it was planned, how sophisticated the planning was. But there's absolutely no question that the virus is already very widespread all across Asia by the time, and really all across the rest of the world as well, by the time Wuhan shut down in late January of 2020. Um, and there's this idea that within the mainstream, there's this idea that the Chinese Communist Party was trying to cover up how bad this virus was, and it
Mm.
plays into this idea that there's this super virus that we have to do even more. We have to do even more of this crazy, testing and tracing and locking down and masking and restricting everything, because there's this super virus that the Chinese Communist Party was trying to cover up. When really the record shows that they were doing the exact opposite, that all those propaganda and fear videos coming out of Wuhan within January in 2020 were doing the exact opposite. They were trying to sow hysteria, all across the world. And of course, everybody, those videos essentially been memory hold.
Yeah.
They're all over social media within January and February of 2020, but now the media has never really discussed them. They may as well have, from their perspective, never even happened, even though they're very well documented, very well recorded. Everybody really experienced them and remembers them. And this is part of this massive terror campaign that coming out of China within early 2020 to sow this widespread hysteria about this virus. So really, by the time you know uh, late February, early March of 2020 comes around, everybody's just terrified of what is this thing coming out of China? What do we do about it? And suddenly, there's a solution. They had this dramatic lockdown, which in many ways was just pure theater. This
Yeah, they're
lockdown in
welding
Wuhan.
people into their apartment. I remember seeing that, like, they're
Yeah,
literally welding the building shut with people
the idea of
inside.
welding people in, and that's just that was as absurd as it is, as horrifying as the idea is of welding people into their homes. That was in many ways the most sophisticated and most influential part of that psyop, because how many times have you heard people say it? I'm sure you've heard it dozens of times. Oh well, the Chinese lockdown the Wuhan lockdown must have been effective. Look how strict they were. They're welding people into their homes. I mean, it sounds ridiculous, and it is ridiculous, but that's just I think it's a more sophisticated level of propaganda than people think a regime like the CCP capable of doing, um, to make themselves look like awful and barbaric, to dupe the rest of the world into thinking this virus is way more deadly than it is. A lot of times people's response is, "Oh no, they couldn't be that smart." Um, I beg to differ. They've been doing this for a century. They have a
Yeah.
century of experience. It's really the only way they ever took power in China. It's the only way they've ever ruled China is through their mastery of propaganda. This particular group, the Chinese Communist Party, how did they win the Chinese Civil War and come to power in China, and how have they ruled it for a century? It's all through propaganda. That is their specific skill set that they do better than really anybody else in the entire world, making themselves look a little bit bad, especially since we don't know how were they actually welding people's into their homes in Wuhan. Maybe to some extent they might have done that to make the theater look a little bit more convincing. But was that like actually a widespread policy that we're doing? We have no idea. Like we don't have much information coming out of China except what the Chinese Communist Party itself lets leak out of China. Now they wanted people to believe that they were welding everybody into their homes because it makes that lockdown stories sound all the more compelling. And it is very compelling to people. To this day, everybody says, oh, well, we have no reason to question China's data because they welded people into their homes. Like nobody else, we couldn't do that. That's why we're able to eliminate this virus from all of
Mm.
China by shutting down one city for 2 months because they could weld people in. Like, they were able to do things that nobody else could do. We never had a real lockdown here. Yeah, sure, like we canceled
Your local
everybody,
restaurants
closed
closed, and you
schools.
can't go
Yeah,
to the concert. Yeah.
we closed everything down and condemned millions of people to starve, and like millions of people lost their jobs. So that wasn't a real lockdown. Only China is capable of real lockdown. Whenever everybody says those words real lockdown, they usually don't say it explicitly because they know it sounds stupid, but it's always harkens back to China.
Mm.
Real lockdown, lockdown has no precedent within epidemiology or within the Western world. The idea of lockdown comes from Xi Jinping and that Wuhan lockdown in China. So whenever people say real lockdown, and they know it even if they won't admit it, they are saying, the Wuhan lockdown,
The China
uh,
lockdown. Yeah.
the China lockdown. Everybody who endorses this idea of a real lockdown, of just locking down even harder, is endorsing this idea that, yeah, China really did eliminate this virus by shutting down the city for a couple months. Um, it's just introducing that absurdity, and that's really how totalitarianism has always worked, is by getting the population, uh motivating the population to an absurd sort of unobtainable goal, and that
Yeah.
sort of motivating force around this idea of zero COVID, which is a very obvious lie. You look
It's
at,
like utopia. It's like we're
yeah,
seeking utopia, heaven on earth.
exactly, and you look at, China's, graph, which, I put on the, cover of the book, you just have this increasing case, and suddenly, it's
Oh,
like
yeah.
nothing. Yeah, you can see the graph right there, you see the
It's the
cases
yellow line
increasing,
going up.
and suddenly late February 2020, just no more, just like flat lines. That is so stupid, and for anybody who's worked in, auditing or forensics or law, that is just the dumbest thing that you've ever seen in your life. It's so obviously forged, but it's getting people, and to this day they still do. They still endorse this absurdity that that is real, that we have no reason to question China's data. Their lockdown worked. They were able to eliminate that virus, and we know they did because they willed the people in. And it goes back to that circular logic that, and the other reason they say that this China couldn't have forwarded their data is because they know that this virus is so scary, that it's so dangerous, and they know
Yeah.
that because why? Because of the impression the Chinese Communist Party gave them at the very beginning of the crisis, that there were people falling dead in the streets. All those videos were, of course, fake. There's the data coming out of China saying like 5% death rate, and like spreads to everybody. It like spreads like 5 times faster than the flu. And it's just like this super virus, and like, oh, but we're able to eliminate it by coming together with this Wuhan lockdown.
And welding people in.
Yeah, there's like this virus, like so much deadlier, and there's long COVID. Like you could, be like brain damage for like your rest of your life if you get this virus. Now everybody has this stupid virus. Like it's just like it's like a cold or a flu, and we have all the data to show that the death rate is
Yeah.
less than 0.1% is the UK's official what they know understand the death rate to be now. Um, cases are all-time highs. Virtually everybody, I'm sure everybody knows that, everybody they know has, COVID at this point or has had it.
Exactly.
Everything we initially thought we knew about this virus, being so deadly, all the information that initially came from China, has all been falsified. It's all been proven wrong. Yet people are still pursuing these totalitarian policies, this goal of zero COVID, because that initial impression they got was so manipulative and so convincing to them that they can't let that go. It's that sort of psychologically sophisticated messaging.
Well, and if you look at what mechanisms would be required to do that, it's not just Tedros and the fact that he was a part of a former terror group in Ethiopia before, with the help of the CCP being put in charge of the WHO. But it's so much more than that, because for the lockdowns to work, for the mandates to work, for all those things to work, the people actually have to go along with it, right?
Right.
To a certain degree. And so if again, looking at the images that were spreading from, the videos of people falling down, dying, you had that fear happen, right? But that fear is just the first step. Then they had to manage the information. They had to manage the right narrative, with the first one being that the lab, that the virus didn't escape from a lab, but it was actually from a bat. It was a scary thing that comes from like a wet market in China. So you start with the initial kind of domino, but then they have to maintain that through social media, control the media, the public health officials, all parroting the exact same narrative. And something that you revealed, which I thought was incredible, was the amount of control that China has over social media. I've tried getting a blue check mark on Twitter. It's impossible, right? Unless they say you have to be responsible for hashtag trends and all these different things. And it's like, okay, I can't even try for that. But you showed examples of how a Chinese professor or a Chinese doctor with a blue check mark on Twitter and only a handful of followers, yet one of the followers just so happens to be the editor of one of China's biggest publications, like what you exposed through that, but then also the bot networks was just that, like you talk about the skill of propaganda. This takes it to a whole new level. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. This is very much a sort of multi-level influence operation that they have used with the response to COVID-19. At the starting with the very top, you have the World Health Organization, which I think everybody knows that the World Health Organization is in the pocket of the Chinese Communist Party. You have Tedros, this former war criminal, who is a stooge of the Chinese Communist Party. So at the very highest international organizations, you have the influence of the CCP. You also have the influence of the Chinese Communist Party within the scientific community. Imperial College just so happens to be, dubbed China's best academic partner in the West. They have this, long time relationship with the Chinese Communist Party. Xi Jinping only visited the UK one time during his time as general secretary, and during that time he visited exactly one university. And what do you know? It's Imperial College, the one that happens to have the greatest influence within the entire world, with their models on the response to this virus.
So
So,
wait,
at
just
the very
so quickly
highest
on that
level.
point, the Imperial College, they're the college that Xi Jinping visited, in his one visit to the UK, and they
Yeah.
just so happened to be the college that what they published. It was a model about the potential death of COVID, right? It was, and that model they published became the more of the fear fuel to get the whole world to agree to lockdowns. Am I understanding that correctly?
That's exactly right. Yeah, that's a big part of that initial story. So shortly after all those scary videos, that story, which also proved to be fake, about Li Wenlang, this whistleblower blowing the whistle on the super virus. Shortly after that, so everybody's already terrified. And then you have this model that comes out of Imperial College with Neil Ferguson saying, 2 or 3 million people within the United States are going to die if we don't all go into lockdown. We can potentially reduce that to, way, way less if we do all these tight lockdown measures. And that model, I think, more than any other that has come out, really drove home that terror that people are all like experiencing anecdotally and very viscerally through their own social media. Suddenly there was this academic stamp on it because you had this model out of Imperial College saying that millions of people are going to die if we don't go into lockdown. That had a huge influence on getting leaders to adopt this lockdown policy. And yeah, you dig into that, and it just so happens that Imperial College has, gets the most money from China of any, UK university.
Imagine that.
Uh, Touts itself as China's best academic partner in the West. Has tons of collaborations with China in various fields and all kinds of different scientific fields. Has openly, worked very closely with China on the response to COVID. Neil Ferguson himself is the one who produced that model for Imperial College, is on record saying, "Yeah, we didn't think we could do it, but then China did it, and then we saw Italy do it, and you're like, yeah, let's shut everything down. We didn't think we could get away with it." Is these exact words, but then Italy do it, and we realized we could get away with it. It's exact quote, and that's all that this really was. Uh, and Xi Jinping, yeah, he visited the UK exactly one time and, visited Imperial College. It's, this very close relationship with China there, that this institution, that more than really any other, has driven this sort of apocalyptic dystopian response to the pandemic. All these models, of course, have turned out to have been, completely exaggerated, completely hysterical, and wrong. They've been falsified by real world data. Of course, we did not have, these millions of deaths within the first 6 months or whatever. But that, that terror is what, drove this entire apocalyptic lockdown response around the world. So you have the influence of the Chinese Communist Party at the very highest levels at the World Health Organization, within corruption in the scientific community, Imperial College, also scientific journals such as the Lancet. You
Yeah.
have the editor in chief of the Lancet, praising China virtually every juncture. Pens this entire editorial about how like the Chinese Communist Party, ever since going back to Chairman Mao, who secured like the territory of the Chinese Communist Party and like made China independent, great country. Just nothing to do with science or epidemiology or anything. Just like this long screed about how great the Chinese Communist Party is. And this is the editor in chief of the Lancet, one of the world's premier scientific journals, which had a huge impact on the world's response. Actually was one of the ones who testified and um, advised the government of the United Kingdom, along with Neil Ferguson, early in the crisis. And they have, the Lancet, his publication, has also had, a major impact on the world's response. So within, the WHO, the scientific community, the influence of the Chinese Communist Party on officials, all across the world. And then at the very sort of personal level, as you were saying, you have this propaganda campaign, especially within social media. And, the influence of the Chinese Communist Party at these social media companies, as you were saying, there was this, this ridiculous account that fortunately this one was caught. We don't know how many were not caught, but this account was verified, just kind of instantly verified. Was only about, I don't know, weeks or a month old, had like very few followers, and had a stock photo. Actually, somebody found that the photo this account was using was just a stock photo of like
Of a Chinese
of a
doctor,
Korean,
right?
yeah, a Korean man, that had been used it for countless other times, and it was kind of instantly verified as a doctor, claiming itself to be like a doctor, qualified to opine on the response to COVID-19 and other things. And of course, as you were saying, one of the few followers that this this supposed doctor, verified doctor head, was the editor in chief of one of the Chinese Communist Party's propaganda outlets.
All these
And
coincidences.
yeah, and that was after it got so much attention in the press and on Twitter and everything, this account was banned. But that just goes to show that the Chinese Communist Party somehow has enough influence at Twitter to actually be making these fake verified Twitter doctors. I mean, that's just unbelievable. Verified Twitter doctors during a supposed public health crisis. I mean, that is just an unbelievable amount of influence on the response.
Yeah.
Did Twitter ever apologize or like make a statement about this? No, they just quietly deleted the account. Who knows how many others are out
Yeah.
there?
Yet
And
you
that's
have
only a small
Twitter banning, Robert Malone, who's the inventor of the mRNA technology,
yeah, yeah,
just
censoring
2 days
everyone.
ago. So,
Yeah, censoring everyone who has a different opinion about this. They've blocked, Martin Koldorf, really brilliant Harvard epidemiologist, one of the most qualified within the field for having the wrong opinion, which apparently they know what that opinion should be. People who are extraordinarily qualified just for having the wrong opinion, while, the Chinese Communist Party is apparently making these verified Twitter doctors, uh, without repercussions. It's just unbelievable. And that only scratches the surface because that is, just one example of a fake verified account. I mean, it is well known that the Chinese Communist Party has thousands of these fake bots that they run all over the world.
oh,
And a
they're
bit of background
the
about that.
Ascent Army, right?
Yeah, yeah. And that goes way back, actually, over a decade at this point, that the Chinese Communist Party has had very sophisticated social media propaganda. And for a long time, this is purely a domestic campaign that they ran as part of their own, decades long domestic propaganda. Is to have actually they employ hundreds of thousands of full-time propagandists within China to just post this praise of the party and kind of quash any sort of dissent that might arise on social media. They post actually billions of comments every single year, and this is primarily confined within China until about 2017. Now, what happens around 2017 is that Xi Jinping takes this very sophisticated domestic propaganda apparatus and unleashes it around the world. And so now all of a sudden you have this um, very sort of well trained propaganda machine within China doing the same thing all across the world. And these are social media sites, all of which are blocked in China. You have Twitter, Facebook, YouTube. All these sites are blocked within China, but suddenly there's filled with these fake accounts and bots from China, opining on all kinds of subjects. And during COVID-19, this really gets pushed into overdrive. And a lot of this sort of response to COVID-19, this totalitarian response to COVID-19 that we've seen all over the world, is really, the influence of the Chinese Communist Party, uh, institutional influence, media influence, and social media propaganda pushed into absolute overdrive, just like the highest gear that it can go. Um, and so suddenly you have all these bots that were traced back to China. In one example, you had hundreds of thousands of these comments is in March 2020, just before the entire world in lockdown, just saying, just admiring China's Wuhan lockdown in very similar words. They're all saying like, oh, we're just sitting here washing our hands. And that's the key word that
Mm.
was used to locate all these bots. You have hundreds of thousands sharing this video of the Wuhan lockdown, this great Wuhan lockdown where the people came together and eluded this virus. And they're all saying the exact same thing. They're all like, praising like, whoa, China did this Wuhan lockdown, and we're sitting here washing our hands. Not only do they say we're washing our hands, they make the exact same comment in every dialect in the world, in every single country in the world, and the dialect of that
Wow.
country, and every language in the world. You can go through these bots and identify, at one point when I first found this campaign that the Chinese Communist Party had done, I went through and would just type in a country and there it is, within the dialect of that country saying, "Oh, we're just washing our hands," in the dialect of South Africa or Ghana or Mexico or Colombia, France, you name it, any country in the world, you could go in and type that country and find that comment, sharing China's great Wuhan lockdown and chastising their leaders. Oh, I wish we were doing that. We're just sitting here washing our hands where we should be going into lockdown like China. So that is just one of the propaganda campaigns that was caught. and found after the fact, and now it's been wiped off of social media. It was up there for you'd find these bots, these posts for about a year before Twitter took them down. Um, but then, other campaigns, who knows how many there are, but others that, we were able to identify where bots actually came in and just started, went straight to the feeds of leaders who
Oh,
had
like
initially
Brian
resisted
Kemp or
lockdown.
Kristi Noem, right?
Correct, correct. So Kristi Noem around April 2020, she became somewhat well known for resisting. She was one of the few governors who didn't have a lockdown. And what happens is around the time when everybody else is shutting down and she is refusing to, suddenly her feed is stormed. All these people, just like um, all
Oh,
these
terrible
bots,
comments.
just these awful comments when you actually read them. Just really disturbing comments, accusing her of genocide and like she's gonna have blood on her hands. And they all say the same thing, you're gonna have blood on your hands, Christy. And you look at these accounts and they're posting these exact same comments with like governors all across the country. You're gonna have blood on your hands if you don't, adopt this lockdown. Like one of the most ridiculous. Look to the Far East; they show you how to like really handle this virus. That's just these really disturbing comments. You never see anything like this on Christy Nova's feed before, suddenly she becomes this anti-lockdown governor, but suddenly just stormed with hundreds and thousands of these comments about how she's this horrible person for not adopting a lockdown like China. Um, then later on, Brian Kemp, as he said, he becomes the first governor to open up. He actually did initially fall for it and lock down the state of Georgia, where I was living there at the time. But and then he is actually the first governor to stop the lockdown and reopen up. And shortly after he does that, all these bots come to his account, and a totally unrelated post where is paying homage, just something like a tribute to a congressman who passed away.
Oh, I remember that
Uh,
one, yes.
yeah, yeah, and so totally unrelated post, but suddenly all these bots storm his account and saying in very, again in sort of identical language, like, take his name out of your mouth, Brian Kemp, and like you killer, with like and then just like this totally ridiculous stuff about how like he shouldn't be reopening his state. He's gonna have blood on his hands again for reopening and not having this lockdown. And again, just totally identical language. Take his name out of your mouth,
Yeah, I
you
remember it was the
filth,
same. It
like
was really weird language. It was like
yeah,
it
really,
wasn't. It was very strange when you see that same thing, like washing your hands, or
yeah,
yeah, it was like
very
he
conspicuous
was
language.
honoring a fallen congressman. It was like take his name out of your mouth. It's like
Yeah,
why is
it's
everyone
always a
repeating
variation that
that?
take his name out of your mouth,
Yeah,
you killer, you monstrosity for not,
mm,
doing this lockdown. It's just, these very sort of conspicuous propaganda campaigns, these sort of grassroots agitprop campaigns targeted at leaders who resisted these lockdowns, sort of all over social media, and then broader ones just advertising, China's response to the pandemic. And how much impact does that social media propaganda have? I mean, enough. We're
it's
still doing this
significant.
2
Yeah,
years on. They shut down the entire world, and
yeah.
the entire world is still obsessed with this narrative of somehow getting rid of this virus, regardless of how deadly it's actually proven to be. Which is, from the
Well,
very
and
beginning, it just wasn't.
one of my questions, which and you touched on this, which I thought was one of the most enlightening parts of your book, was why are leaders going along with this? Because it's
Right.
one thing to say, okay, you got duped in the beginning. Maybe all of us did. You had some fear of it, but even you said, look, doesn't matter what data has come out, they're still holding on to this original thing. Even the original study from the empirical science or college in UK has been disproven. So, when asking yourself why are leaders continuing to do this, especially when you look to places like Australia or New Zealand or Germany, Italy, where they're not just, it's not like they're just, doing the basic lockdown. They're going into full blown totalitarianism. My wife is from Australia and thank goodness she's here. We have family there. And what we're hearing coming out of Australia is it's almost like it's Germany 1930s.
Mm,
Police knocking on the doors. They had a neighbor that was having. She had 6 kids, I think, or 5 kids that were her children. They're having a birthday party, and they had balloons up. The police basically stormed the birthday party because thinking she was having other children over that weren't her own children. Like
yeah.
it's that level of insanity. So really the question is, why are people doing this? Why are people that we've elected to look out for us basically selling us off to the Chinese Communist Party?
Yeah. it's a variety of factors, and it's really, it's absolutely awful what's happening in Australia, and the reason it's gotten so bad there is because they can. Um, you know, just yesterday there was a quote from CDC Director Rochelle Walensky where she was saying, "Oh, the reason we reduce quarantine is because this all depends on what the public will tolerate, what they'll actually allow us to do. So we're just going to do as much tyranny, as much of these restricting people's behavior as they allow us to do." And that's, you see that manifest itself most clearly in Australia, where they got that taste of what they thought was victory at the beginning. They thought they had, everybody was praising Australia for having achieved what nobody else except, supposedly China could do. It seemed like they had achieved zero COVID for a while. So they got that taste of victory, and the entire population got that taste of victory. And so they, really bought into this idea that they could achieve zero COVID. It's just implemented even more tyranny. Um, and that's why they embraced that so much. It led to the longest lockdowns in the world. They had police in the streets, just these like insane police checkpoints banning protests. They're firing rubber bullets at people during protests. Just absolutely ghastly stuff that you should never see in a democratic country. As you were saying, it is like Germany in the 1930s. What we're seeing there, it's just absolutely horrifying. And it's all because that's what the government has been allowed to do, because frankly, this stuff is just more popular there. It's what the population, in some ways, wants them to do, or at least a
Yeah.
significant portion has asked them to do it.
Well, their media
Like,
is
look,
very, very controlled. The only
correct.
more, I guess, say more right-leaning and more conservative media is Sky News, which is owned by Murdoch.
Yep.
But even that's, it's kind of like your Fox News here. So even there, you're getting a little bit of a tainted truth. But the majority of the media there are, it's like you have like the equivalent of CNN everywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of the people, that's what our families told us, is that they're very supportive. Like they're
Yep.
excited about it. They're like, okay, we're in this together. They've taken those same talking points. Not to mention the fact that they got their guns taken away a long time ago, so they have no way to defend themselves, and there's all kinds of other things I think that allow for that. But yeah, it's just frightening. And so, but what do you think? Like, is it blackmail? Is it the reputation of the leaders? I think in your book you talked about how these leaders, like, they've already pushed it so far that they can't turn back now, because if they were to say, "Look, we're no longer going to be doing this," they're admitting that they were wrong the first while that they're pushing forward these policies.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, there's a variety of factors. Obviously there's a good amount of just raw corruption, and some leaders are corrupt. As you're saying in Australia, a lot of corruption and propaganda there in the media, and then you have officials who are just blatantly corrupt. You have Dan Andrews, the notorious premier of Victoria, Australia, who's had this entire propaganda campaign around himself. He employs just tons of people who are very close to the Chinese Communist Party, and one of his chief aides, did an entire years long propaganda course at a CCP academy. It's just very blatant sort of corruption there, and blatant closeness to the Chinese Communist Party that is obviously influencing this policies. Victoria, Australia, where Melbourne is located, has had the longest lockdowns of any jurisdiction in the world. Does that help them at all? No, but the public, enough of the public apparently supports it, and that's why they're able to get away with it. And it's just absolutely horrifying for the people who have been dragged along with this, who haven't supported it at all. But that's what the public will allow them to do. So there's a few different factors there. Some of it is very sort of blatant corruption there, just officials who are pursuing the zero COVID strategy, doing what China wants them to do, endorsing China's narrative, because they are in a lot of cases just bought by China, or at least close to China. So there definitely is some of that going on. There's others that I suspect that is going on. And some of it is because, they bought into the propaganda themselves, um, and just that sort of political zeitgeist. Obviously here in the United States, it's Democrats who have really endorsed these. In most cases, in general, have gone along with these policies and done lockdowns and mandates more than red states. In general, there are exceptions. So some of that is just sort of groupthink and going along with that propaganda of the zeitgeist. And a big part of this was the psychological sophistication of roping people into something that was so awful to begin with. And that's why
Mm.
those initial lockdowns, everything stems from those initial lockdowns, which in truth they didn't last that long. They lasted only in most cases, I think a month or two. When everything was really shut down, when suddenly the unemployment rolls, like unemployment swelled like at the fastest rate that it ever has in American history and around the world, and everybody was going hungry, and there were miles long lines at food banks. The really sort of apocalyptic dystopian lockdown only lasted for the first month or two, and that's when most of the damage was done. That's when the most people were really devastated. Their lives were just completely upended. um, and that's when most people, I think, were cast into starvation in some cases, especially in the developing world. So once leaders had embraced that, staked so much of their political career, their integrity, their entire um, reputation, and just their entire identity to that lockdown in the beginning, that idea that there was a super virus that they had to lock down, they had to throw everything they had in it to stop the spread, the 15 days to slow the spread, and we have to keep the hospitals, whatever, they come up with all kinds of justifications for why they did this ridiculous policy that destroyed so many lives. Once they had bought into that, and these leaders all know that they could have done more to stop it, and they didn't. They went along with that. In most cases, they did that lockdown. And once they have bought into that, they destroyed so many lives in the hopes that, they could save some. They have to feel like they did the right thing, and they'll do anything to feel like they
Mm.
didn't just destroy millions of lives for nothing, because nobody wants to think that. You think about your average politician, your average governor, or even national leaders. In a lot of cases, these are not like big people. They win an election. These are people who are usually mediocre lawyers in most cases. You suddenly they won an election. When you win that election, you feel like you're the chosen one. It's like, wow, my life has meaning. Like it all meant something, because now I'm important. I want now I'm like a governor. It's like this. I'm like a big deal. I'm gonna finally I can do something. And so that this is your chance. Most governors, it's kind of a ceremonial role in most cases. They don't really do that much when it comes right into it. But suddenly there's this crisis. They can make this
Mm.
big giant decision. There's this super virus, and they're being told that if they shut down, they can eliminate this virus like China did, and everybody else is doing it, and all the fashionable people are doing it. The WHO is doing it, and in Europe they're doing it, and especially in left and places like California here in the United States, everybody wants to be more like Europe. You hear that all the time. So suddenly Europe is doing these lockdowns now. It's like really fashionable. So they implement it. They say, okay, we're going to throw everything we have at this virus. And we're going to shut everything down. And of course, we now know in hindsight, all they managed to do there was destroy millions of lives, destroy their economies for absolutely nothing. It didn't slow the spread. Um, it didn't really save any lives. It destroyed a lot of lives. It didn't actually save any. But they can't admit that.
They
To
can't
say that
backtrack.
they can't backtrack. To say that, I was the chosen one. Suddenly I have like this power. And, the only real big decision that I was asked to make turned out to be something that was, absolutely horrendous. One of the most,
Yeah.
barbaric and, awful episodes in all of history. And I was roped into just this giant sort of, criminal operation, this giant influence operation. That's an extraordinarily difficult thing for people to admit, that the role they played in that they actually might have
Which and I guess,
destroyed a lot of
sorry to
lives.
jump in, like, that's really how blackmail works.
Yeah.
That's how corruption works, is that it's never one big thing. It's the next thing, and then the next thing, and the next thing, and so it just and a lot of times, they say that the road to hell is paved in good intentions, right? With good intentions. And
Mhm.
so they think they're doing the right thing, but actually they realize that they're doing a very bad thing. But then as you get maybe 2 or 3 more of those stacked up, well, they can only go one direction, right?
Yep.
Because it's like if they have blackmail on you, say at first it was that you took a $10,000 bribe. Well, eventually it gets up to the level of, maybe even pedophilia, which is what, you look at the Ghislaine Maxwell case that just ended, right? So it's
Yep.
like at the highest level. So as you get more power, they have to have more on you. And I remember earlier on in the pandemic, maybe it was 6 months in or so, the Epoch Times published an editor's, I think it was a note from the editors. It was one of the more serious things, and they really highlighted that the places that experienced the worst lockdowns and the worst um, protocols and mandates and suffered the most from the virus overall were the places that had the most developed relationships with the Chinese Communist Party. And
Yeah,
they pointed that out, like Italy, for instance, which had recently signed on the Belt and Road Initiative, just so happened to be the place. Well, China is heavily involved in Italy, Australia, New Zealand. China is very heavily involved in those countries. But if you look at
yeah,
United States, where you have different states, what's China's involvement with California and Newsom, for instance,
yeah, exactly.
versus Ron DeSantis. So I think that you can really look and see. And so there's one more point that I wanted to kind of bring up with that in terms of how do these leaders fall to this. And you made a point in your book that I thought was just incredible, talking about the Tiananmen Square massacre and the persecution of Falun Gong in China, and how both of those, and even the Uyghur camps in China and the concentration camps, that basically, and especially starting with the Tiananmen Square massacre in '89, that was China's way of gauging the reaction of the West and saying, will the West come out and say, look, if that's how you treat your citizens, we're not going to go along with it, or will they come out and say, hey, that's bad, but let's make a lot of money together? Can you explain that a little bit? Because that was incredible, the point that you had made.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. You know, the Chinese Communist Party has, for decades, really throughout its entire history, been normalizing the atrocities that it needs to commit to stay in power. So, beginning with the Square massacre, the Chinese Communist Party saw what had happened very recently within the Soviet Union, that the Soviet Union was nearing collapse because they had begun to open up, especially under Gorbachev. They had, started to implement some liberal reforms, and that was leading to their collapse. And they suddenly there were these massive protests in Tiananmen Square. These, just miles and miles of protesters and students, and everybody was really hopeful. And international, filmmakers and media outlets around the world were really optimistic that finally, China was going to open up, and they were going the way of the Soviet Union. They were going to, Chinese Communist Party was going to let, democracy bloom in China. And of course, Deng Xiaoping does not let that happen. He has the, biggest one of the biggest peacetime massacres in history instead. And they gambled that, the world would let them get away with that. And that's exactly what happened after an initial uproar, like, oh, this is awful. We can't let them get away with, murdering all their own people. Um, and then China was isolated for a couple of years, but then, very quietly, world leaders, beginning with George H.W. Bush, normalized it and just resumed relations. And ever since then, with the persecution of the Falun Gong, initially it got a lot of coverage, and no, like, they're, committing this awful campaign of, genocide and, repression and enslavement of the Falun Gong, because the Falun Gong was a religious movement that was beginning to get a lot of independent power that the Chinese Communist Party um, felt threatened by. So that sort of began their entire system for repression of ethnic groups and of religious groups was with the Falun Gong. And after an initial uproar, again, the Western leaders and the Western media ultimately normalizes that. So over these decades, the Chinese Communist Party is learning what they can get away with, what Western leaders will accommodate, essentially. And they learned all that, and Xi Jinping is watching this, and he realizes that, the lengths that these leaders will go to, sometimes, even throwing their own people under the bus, throwing not only Western values under the bus. And so COVID-19, the response to COVID-19 is a test of that. We will put this ridiculous narrative out there, all these lies about how we eliminated this virus, and, and we're just gonna not even tell the world about what we know about this virus, which is a horrible crime in itself. Think about how many lives could be saved just by, the Chinese Communist Party telling the world what it knew about this virus. What it said, oh no, we're not doing that. And the world has just sort of let them do that, knowing that, it's cost millions of lives. The initial guidance they give everybody on ventilators, which is very deadly, it has killed thousands of people. Nobody has challenged them on that either. That's how much they're letting the Chinese Communist Party get away with. And how did the CCP know they could do that? How did Xi Jinping know that he could get away with that? That Western leaders would go to that lengths to let them get away with these crimes against their own people? Because look at what the Western world let them get away with the Falun Gong. Look what they let them get away with Tiananmen Square, and even going back to the crimes of Mao Zedong and the Great Leap Forward, which ultimately were sort of normalized by letting the Chinese Communist Party into the international system. This regime that has committed so many mass murders and genocides and just unthinkable crimes for any sort of halfway decent regime has been normalized by the international community. And the results of
Mm.
this, that sort of devil's bargain, is what we're witnessing. And as you were saying about blackmail, the Chinese Communist Party is very well known by anybody who works in international relations to engage in sort of bribery and blackmail of world leaders around the world. And so a lot of these leaders are simply bought. As you were saying, you look all across the world, and if you track, their closeness with the Chinese Communist Party, how close their relations are with China, the closer they are with China, in almost all cases, the more dedicated they've been um, to these restrictions, these behavioral restrictions, and endorsing China's response to COVID, and having zero COVID policies of their own, and having this crazy, nutty totalitarian response to COVID-19. And some of that is corruption. Um, but with corruption, with bribery and blackmail, there's only so many people who respond to bribery. A lot of people will say, no, that's not. Yeah, this is not something I would go along with. And even with blackmail, there's only so many people who blackmail because there's enough good people out there who won't respond to blackmail. But what is the most powerful form of blackmail of all? It is protecting people's identity, protecting their ego. That once they have blood on their hands, once they've committed human lives to one specific narrative, being able to admit that they destroyed millions of lives for nothing, something
Mm.
very, very few people uh, are able to do, are able to get comfortable with themselves after doing that and admit that they did all that for nothing. It's that great leap forward psychology. The Chinese Communist Party has studied the Great Leap Forward more than any organization in the world. It's very important, as they should, because this is the largest famine in human history. To this day, it's unknown how many people died, but it's well known to be somewhere in the range of 15 to 50 million people died during Mao's Great Leap Forward. Um, and nobody has studied how that happened more than the Chinese Communist Party.
Mm.
They know a lot about the psychology that went into that, and it's very similar to what we're seeing now with COVID-19. That the leaders uh, surrounding Mao Zedong, endorsed this idea that they had to collectivize everything, and if they did that, then the economy would be great, and everybody would have more food than ever. And so they put everybody onto these communes. Of course, the exact opposite happens. The communes are producing nothing of value. Food production just plummets, and suddenly, you have the greatest famine of all time. But the leaders who were surrounding Mao at that time couldn't admit that they had done all this for nothing. Couldn't admit that they had caused this famine, that they had destroyed millions of lives. So they just kept doubling down. They couldn't. The narrative couldn't be wrong. Communism couldn't be wrong. Putting people on communes can
Mm.
fail.
Interesting.
There's just no way we could destroy all these lives for nothing. The Chinese Communist Party is well aware that that is how the Great Leap Forward happened. They studied that. But what is the conclusion they come to? They conclude that it was necessary. They conclude that, yes, the leaders around Mao's regime couldn't admit their error, and that's why you had this massive famine. But that was a necessary step in binding the Chinese people to the Chinese Communist Party and merging the Chinese people with the Chinese Communist Party. They know that, and they say that that was a good thing. Um, so they take what they know about the psychology that played out during the Great Leap Forward and they globalize it. They unleash that all over the world. They have so now you have all these leaders who they endorse these lockdowns quick, quick. You got to shut down everything, and yeah, you're going to destroy tons of lives, but you're going to save lives. So yeah, it makes sense. Don't think about it, but just do it. Yeah, and so once they've done that, now wait, I destroyed a bunch of lives from nothing. There's no way that could be right. There's no way that could be. I'm a good enough person that I wouldn't take a bribe. I wouldn't even, in some cases, respond to blackmail. But accepting that, you know, I, you know, I killed, like had this power as a governor, and the only thing I did with it was to destroy lives and go along with this operation that I never should have done. No, no, that can't be right. So I'm just going to keep doubling down. I just this, and there's enough. There's these weird zero COVID people telling me that what I did was a good thing, so I'm going to listen to them. I'm just going to shut everyone out. I'm not going to listen to people who tell me, show me study after study that says that this was the most disastrous policy of all time, and none of these restrictions are doing anything. I don't want to hear it. Protecting their sort of ego and their identity is the most powerful force that you can hold over somebody psychologically, I think. Sorry, Seth. Actually, I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now? Okay. So you're, let's see. Okay. Oh, you muted yourself. You can unmute yourself.
Perfect. Okay. Now we're
Okay,
back.
so you can hear me now. Okay. All
Yes,
right,
sir.
great. Thank you. So we're gonna now transfer over just to Rise TV. And for those of you that want to try Rise TV, there's a free trial in the description below. We're gonna have a Q&A over there, but I want to also get into my final question, which is what is China's end game? Like, where does this go, right? After you've built together this idea, this huge plan of orchestrating all this, well, where does it lead to? So we're gonna head over to Rise. For those of you on Facebook, YouTube, Rumble, thank you so much for joining us. If you want to try Rise Out, I recommend it. It's a great platform. We have hundreds and hundreds of videos and content. We've done so many deep dives into communism and transhumanism and all kinds of great stuff that you won't find on YouTube. So again, there's a link below, or even if you want to just pop on over and check out the rest of our video and then kind of peace out. I won't judge you. So let me go ahead and end these streams. So give me 1 second, okay? And I'll get these. We've got, okay, goodbye, Rumble and YouTube.